Hello, and welcome to a video lecture, and this one's going to be on Chapter 3, Federalism. So I'm going to start here in our module. If you go to Learning Modules, Module 1, and this is in Lesson 2. We have Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 together with one giant PowerPoint. So here are the test materials, the 15 study guide points in the essay. We have a discussion board, and we have an assignment. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint, and let us get started. So we're going to look at the development and purpose of American federalism and assess the current nature of federalism. So these are medical marijuana laws, and you can see in the book they had fewer, but if you go to procon.org and look it up, and I can do that, but I think here I'll just put them into slides. So here's the 28 states, and note that Ohio is now one of those states. So the question is, medical marijuana laws, is medical marijuana legal anywhere in the United States? The answer is no. It's legal in some states and not in others, and that's why it's in the Federalism chapter. This falls under state powers. Here's the Ohio law in specific, which started during the fall term on September 8th and continues to be fully operational in September of 2018. So federalism. Federalism is actually an Old English word for sharing, and it makes our political system one of the most complex. And the question is, how was federalism used as a compromise in the United States? And the answer to that question is that federalism is real how power should be distributed between the nations, the nation, the national government, and the states. And it is that sharing which was one of the great compromises in the Constitution. So how many governments does the United States have? Oh, thousands of governments. There's 3,000 counties. There's untold number of sewer districts, school districts, so thousands. And what are the different levels of government? Well, nation, state, and local. So basically we have two citizenships. We are citizens of the country as well as citizens in this state of Ohio. This will be a class exercise that we'll do, so I'll skip over that for now. So federalism and the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution has enumerated powers. So that's where it is, Article 1, Section 8. And enumerated means, the word there, numerate, means numbered. So the national government, Congress, can print money, tax, build armies, declare war. Then, in Article 1, Section 10, it says Congress has the power to carry out all things necessary and proper to the list. And that's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And in the study guide, it asks, how does the Supreme Court, especially John Marshall's interpretation of the Necessary and Proper Clause, affect the power of Congress? And the answer is that John Marshall in McCulloch v. Maryland gave a very broad interpretation to the Necessary and Proper Clause, which meant there are very, very few restrictions on Congress. They can pretty well do almost anything they want because of the power of these two clauses put together. The Supremacy Clause, in terms of the relation between the nation and the state, is found in Article 6, and that's what the study guide asks, where can the Supremacy Clause be found, be specific, Article 6 of the Constitution, and it says anytime that the Constitution gives power to the national government, it is supreme. So when federal and state laws conflict, if the federal law is constitutional, it will prevail. Concurrent powers are when powers are shared. Maybe there's, I would say in some sense roads are shared. States kind of run roads, but the federal government have a lot of grants kind of attached to them. So here's the national powers, the state powers, and then the concurrent powers. They list here, both can pass and enforce laws, establish highways. Again, I said roads. The national power admit a new state into the Union, as an example, a state power ratify amendments to the Constitution. So the changing balance over time. Well, it started as dual federalism, and the study guide asks, what is it? And the example often given is dual federalism is like a layer cake. You can eat it, and there's a layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 maybe. So there is a clear division of power between the national government and the states. So it's a layer. What one can do, the other can't, very typically. That's how we started. Now, cooperative federalism is how that has mingled and overlapped over time. And the trend has been that government has grown at both levels, but there definitely has been a strengthening of the federal government. That has been a lot of what is behind the Tea Party movement. So 3 types of systems, unitary, confederate, and federal. So the study guide question asks, what is the definition of a unitary system? And that's where the central government has all the powers. So for us, that was the English colonies. The government of England had all the power, and we were colonies. Then we fought, obviously, to separate from that. Our first government, called the Articles of Confederation, that's number 38, the study guide question. So where in the U.S. history do we see a Confederate system? And the answer is the Articles of Confederation between 1777 and 1789, and also the southern states, the states that seceded from the Union from 1860 to 1865. So we've had that twice. And then nullification, which is study guide number 40. So what is nullification is what the study guide asks, and that's when a state can nullify a national or national government law in its boundaries. So the U.S. Constitution or U.S. Congress would pass a law saying X, and the state of South Carolina, which is famous for nullification, says, no, not in my state, I'm not going to do it. So that is, nullification is what led the South to kind of succeed from the Union. So a little bit more on sharing. Again, it's the U.S. and the states. So the historical nature, McCulloch v. Maryland, which is number 39. What was the decision of the Supreme Court in McCulloch v. Maryland? And I'll talk a little bit about that when we have some time in class. But in McCulloch, basically, 2 things: that the federal government can create a national bank. That was not on the enumerated list. Printing money was on the list, but not a bank to put the money in. And number 2, the McCulloch v. Maryland case, Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States, and John Marshall, Supreme Court, said you can't do that. If the bank exists, it is supreme, and therefore the state cannot touch it under the Supremacy Clause. So states cannot regulate that which the national government can do. Those are the 2 things of McCulloch. Under the Civil War, again, I talked about nullification, and then eventually it moved to the New Deal in the 30s and 40s. So that's when the country was in a pretty serious depression, and we really needed the economy to get going again. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped forward after he was elected president in 1932 and started large programs to, in the words of the slogan of the time, to prime the pump of the American economy, created Social Security, Works Progress Association. So from that point forward, the national government has been heavily involved in keeping the economy afloat. Before then, it had been called laissez-faire, which meant French for to let alone. So civil rights is another area where the states, particularly after the Civil War, did many things to try to circumvent the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We'll talk a little bit about that under the Civil Rights chapter. So Brown v. Board, 1954, which is the desegregation school case from Topeka, Kansas, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act following that, kind of really broke that. There's still a lot going back and forth on that. And then lastly, social needs. And, you get asked about categorical grants and block grants. So categorical grants, what factor allows the federal government to use categorical grants to coerce the states in doing what it wants? And so road money is a really good example of that. The federal government might give out billions of dollars in road money, and the states have become dependent upon the money. States have to balance their budgets. Local governments have to balance their budgets. The national government can spend in a deficit. So the national government offers money up, says you have to do things in a certain way. Categorical grant is very restricted, and consequently, because of that money arrangement, I often call it a little bit of blackmail there, the states become financially dependent upon it. They can't afford these billion-dollar projects. Now, block grants, number 42, is just the opposite of that. Instead of narrow purpose with a lot of restrictions, block grants are broadly purposed and unrestricted, like law enforcement or healthcare. And that was kind of a reform because there were a lot of complaints about the categorical grant movement. So in the 1980s, a very shift to conservatism. This is the Reagan era, with a lot of emphasis on devolution, basically giving power back to the states and not having as much power in the central government hands. We've also seen other shifts in the 60s, the war on drug. You would look war on drugs, education. A couple of presidents, the Bush 1. No Child Left Behind, that type of stuff. National Security, TSA formed. Bush 2, that was shortly after the 9/11 attack. So what does national government do now? The national government's involved when the states require a national solution. Things like pollution and clean water. To give federal government credit for something, the federal government puts a lot of money into student loans and education, so they want to get in on that. Preempt states from doing certain things, and tying grant money to compliance. Now, one of the big complaints at number 43 is unfunded mandate. So what is that? That's a federal regulation without funding to the state and local governments. Now, it's interesting, local governments also say the same thing. The state passes unfunded mandates onto the local government. So they get it twice and complain a lot about it. So unfunded mandate means, yeah, you need to do this testing and report back to us so we can see you're doing okay. But I'm not going to give any money to do it. You have to do it on your own. No Child Left Behind, again, 2001 from Bush. Affordable Care Act, probably the most controversial of federalism, and that's going to be part of our political discussion. And that's number 45. The question is what is the common nickname for the Affordable Care Act and passed in 2010? Well, that was Obama's signature policy, so it's called Obamacare. And then in 2015, the Common Core, so the Education Core Standard Initiatives cover what policy area, and the Common Core is all about education in Ohio. So I might take a little look at these as we get through the PowerPoint here. Pros and cons of federalism. The national government being involved typically protects individual rights, but it sometimes makes bad policies. Gridlock. It does protect against quick change and dangerous leaders. It does make coordination very hard. At number 3, it encourages innovation, diffusion, but there's often inequities. And many states, Kentucky, where I live, Mississippi, would always, I lived in Arkansas, by the way, Kentucky and Arkansas, and we'd always joke, it's like, thank God for Mississippi because they're worse than both of us. So here's our discussion board. Some on the liberal side argue that the power of judicial review is necessary because it's important to fight for the underdogs, especially minorities. The national government kind of looks out minorities, and so it's the Supreme Court, and they cite Brown v. Board. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we have a class discussion. On the other hand, conservatives tend to argue that the judiciary, which kind of is the watchdog for the underdog and telling people how to protect them, they say, well, yeah, but sometimes there's an abuse of that. And of course, they cite the Sebelius case of 2012, which upheld the Affordable Care Act. So where do you stand on this? Do you lean a little bit more towards states' rights or a little bit more towards the national government kind of philosophy, liberal versus conservative? And that's due February 8th. So there's your discussion board. Essay question is specifically about Obamacare. It is in the news. There's a lot about it lately. That's the most controversial aspect of federalism in this millennium. And do you agree or disagree with the thesis, we should repeal Obamacare? Now, when I first designed this question, it was a thesis. Today, it's a reality. There's going to be some changes to Obamacare as a result of the election. And so cite 3 arguments for or against for your position. So it's not a right or a wrong answer, as with the discussion board. It's very much about your opinion, but link it to good logical arguments and some facts. And then lastly, assignment number 2 is about the Common Core. And I'll unleash that one a little bit later, but I'm giving you a little snapshot of it. And I do want to close by heading out to, again, here's our module that you can get to and look at the PowerPoint. Here's the pro-con site, legalizing marijuana. So you can go to that and look at it. It's very good for that and other documents. Here's the Ohio Department of Education standard revision, the 2 big standards, English and Science and Social Studies. So you got English, Language Arts and Math, Social Studies, and Financial Literacy. Those are the 2 big ones. And there's a timeline here and tells you about when they're going to be done. Ohio's had a bit of a controversy with this because they used a certain testing system, cost millions of dollars. They abandoned it after the first year of using it. So again, the conservatives, they're like, what a dump, the Common Core like a rock, and the liberals say, oh, it's very, very important to kind of hang it in there. And the most recently one, this is something at the time of the video, here is House Speaker Paul Ryan, joined by some other folks, and a recent congressional budget analysis, which was asked for by the Democrats, says, oh, both sides are playing here, says that 18 million people could lose their insurance after partial Obamacare repeal. Of course, Republicans will say, we're repealing it to put something else in its place, so those 18 people will still be covered. They'll just be covered with something different. But we need to keep track of this story over the term. This will be our hot story that we'll be watching, and you have an essay about it. So you've got a little bit here to kind of go through, and I hope this helps. I try not to make these too long, and we'll have a class session. We'll kind of review things at this point. But that's Chapter 3, the story of federalism. Thanks.